Hi guys, welcome back to episode 3 of Perfectly Untrue. Firstly, I just want to say a huge thank you regarding last month's episode. We had a 917% increase in terms of listeners and viewing metrics, with listeners from places outside of just our key demographics. When I first started this podcast, I honestly thought that it wouldn't reach that big of an audience because it was kind of just like a side hobby that I've always wanted to realize. But seeing people listen from across Canada, Washington, Atlanta, LA, Kansas, and even South Korea is just so crazy. So thank you for making my dreams a reality and my voice heard. It means the world to me to be able to share these special stories with you all. Particularly the topics featured in Friendship Recession seem to really speak out to all of you, with a lot of you guys reaching out to me and telling me that you related, which I love to see. So again, if you guys have any podcast recommendations, any topics you want to hear and open the conversation, let me know and I'm totally open to doing it. I wanted to highlight one specific comment from one of our TikTok posts from Trash Couture, who mentioned they feel like the connections that they made previously during the pandemic weren't what they thought they were, that everyone kind of had to perform to a certain degree. They talked about how they felt that a lot of people were struggling due to the pandemic because they didn't know how to navigate a world based on fake performances post-pandemic, while still remaining genuine and true to themselves. So this comment really spoke out to me because it was kind of the exact reason was why I started Perfectly Untrue in the first place. Hearing your thoughts, your comments, and kind of opening up about these day-to-day issues and opening up the conversation in general, this is what I wanted to achieve with Perfectly Untrue. So thank you so much for, kind of trusting me with your thoughts, concerns, and even if it's just a random shower thought. I really do appreciate it and I cherish them a lot with my whole soul. So don't be afraid to reach out, to speak up, and to add on to the conversation. Additionally, I know that we've been having some scheduling conflicts in terms of episodes. Again, we're just really trying to figure everything out. Perfectly Untrue is a team of one. Literally just me. And with this episode specifically, Prayer Stick, I know that there were a couple delays. It's mainly just because, with group episodes, it does take a little bit more work to plan in terms of scheduling. When we have a group of 5 people, I know that seems like a smaller amount, but it's really difficult to try to get everyone's schedules in order. And that's obviously not an excuse because I know you guys do want to hear new content and you guys want to be involved more. But it is just more of an explanation as to why there's been delays with some episodes, but I just want to thank you for being so patient and so kind during the entire process. A lot of you guys have reached out to me in terms of mic recommendations or even little tips and tricks that I can do to get started a little more, so I just really do appreciate that. Additionally, a few disclaimers for this podcast episode specifically, because it was a group podcast, there are a couple mic issues, just because we are still figuring out kind of the mic situation when it comes to group podcasts. So I'm pretty sure in some parts of the episode, there are times where the mic has peaked. We have tried to fix it post-production with, editing and all of that, just to make sure that everything's seamless in terms of sound quality. But just a heads up for any headphone listeners out there, if there's a couple peaks in audio, that's why. So, maybe don't listen with full blast. So just a bit of a heads up. But with all of our disclaimers out of the way, speaking about thoughts and queries, the next topic we'll be talking about in this podcast is something that is really near and dear to my heart. In this episode, we will be talking about, honestly, everything in terms of growing up Asian. The pressures of internalized racism, the effects on one's culture, how that plays in oneself in terms of insecurity and just feelings in general. I know feelings is a big topic, so it's just, it's a lot to kind of conceptualize and compartmentalize, but feelings of inadequacy, stereotypes, and so on, kind of the whole shebang. To start off, I know that these are pretty heavy topics, so let's take each one by one. To start off this episode, I'll be opening up about a story. So, for some context, my family is Buddhist. And every so often, we visit this Buddhist temple to kind of give our prayers to our ancestors, specifically my grandma and grandpa, who are no longer with us. The concept is that with every prayer you give, the monks will pass it on to your ancestors, and it'll eventually lead them to find peace in their next life, when they kind of move on from this world into the afterlife. I know it's kind of a crazy concept to realize, but basically, the more you visit the temple, the more you give each prayer, it'll bring them peace and prosperity. That's kind of, I guess, the main takeaway. And I remember the first time I visited the temple was in grade 11, which is pretty late. So my mom had told me that, today we were visiting a special place with not really much context to the situation, and I was pretty confused. So I walked into this building, which this man had led us into the praying temple specifically, and inside there was like this grand statue of the Buddha and various slots. And these slots, I don't really know how to explain them. They were like red with like kind of gold engravings of everyone's like ancestors, their names and such. But they're just like kind of these small rectangular boxes, and each one of them are like little slots, And basically, these were where your ancestors were kept. So my mom had given me an incense stick, and we had prayed to the Buddha, and then she relit another incense stick so that we could pray towards my grandma and grandpa. And I asked her if I should pray in Cantonese, because I kind of thought that it would have more meaning. Like, it would just be easier for my grandparents to understand. And even though, yes, this is very like a hypothetical, not even hypothetical, sorry, like a very, I don't know, I guess spiritual or like religious situation, because obviously it's not like my grandparents were physically in front of me, but I knew, my grandparents, they could only primarily speak Cantonese. They could speak English, but, Cantonese was their first language and everything, so, I thought it would have a little more weight to it if I spoke in Cantonese for the prayer. And also a bit of context, like, I had never met my grandparents. They had died before I was born, so, everything that I've been told about them were, like, kind of just stories and stuff. But, this was the first time I'd ever gone to the temple, and I really wanted to like kind of connect with my culture and really be there, not only physically but also mentally, like just be present in general. So she agreed, like, yeah, probably it's best if you pray in Cantonese if you can, but the choice is completely up to you. So I began to pray, and, at first the words came easily, like I was able to describe what was happening in my life and, kind of the day-to-day instances that were going on. But when I went on, I kind of found it difficult to find the words to be able to continue my prayers, to find the words to be able to describe such intense feelings. I know in that particular moment, I was going into, I think, my exam season, and I wanted them to wish me good luck with it. And I also wanted to just, like, wish them well, peace, prosperity, and so on. But more importantly, just, like, a happy life for them. But I just, like, couldn't find the proper vocabulary to explain it. And I think that's just because, like, I do know Cantonese to an extent, but it's very much to an extent, like, I have a couple Cantonese friends here and there, but oftentimes we're speaking English with each other, and then obviously at home, like, I'm just talking about, I don't know, doing the dishes or whatever. So, as I continued, I just, like, found myself kind of pausing in between words. Like, I didn't know the words to be able to describe how I was feeling. So because of that, I kind of just gave up, because I was like, okay, you know what, this is not working. And eventually I continued the prayer in English, because I didn't know, how to be able to properly convey the thoughts and feelings that I had in Cantonese. And even though that's like a totally okay experience, like no shame in that, when I had left the temple specifically, like, I felt a little odd. Like, oh, why was this introduced to me so late? And also, like, when I went into the temple in the first place, I was kind of confused as well. Like, obviously, I knew, the basics of praying in the temple and so on and so forth, but I had never done it. So I was kind of confused about the whole thing. Like, the whole experience was just very foreign to me. And, like, the Cantonese that I had easily spoken at home, it just didn't really translate when I was actually trying to express my emotions. Like, when I was trying to have a real conversation, there at the temple, it wasn't really coming across in the way I wanted. And I think the feeling that stuck out to me the most was like, why do I feel like a foreigner, even if it's my own culture? So basically, I'm bouncing off this story. Within this podcast episode, Prayer Stick, we'll be answering a couple of those questions today. However, I'm going to ask a couple of friends to help us out. In our first episode, we have Audrey B., Tiffany Shi, and Chloe Cheng on episode 3 of Prayer Stick. So if you guys want to go around and kind of introduce yourselves.
Hi, my name is Audrey B.
Hi, my name is Chloe Cheng.
And hi, my name is Tiffany Shi.
Just a bit of context for those who are listening about kind of my heritage and, how I grew up. I'm Canadian born and both my parents are from Hong Kong. My mom was more so influenced by Western cultures because she moved to Canada when she was about 12 years old. My dad moved to the States initially for university, and then shortly after he decided to start his life in Vancouver. However, I grew up speaking Cantonese at home, or like a mix of Chinglish, where my parents would speak to me in Cantonese and I kind of respond with a mix. But nonetheless, I kind of grew up with a Cantonese heritage and culture ingrained into my everyday life, from holidays to foods to clothing and the whole shebang. So if you guys want to kind of introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your heritage and where you're from, where your parents are from, just so the viewers have a bit more context as to the overall episode.
I am Chinese Canadian. I was born Canadian and my parents are from China. My dad went to Alaska for work in 2000, I don't know when, 2000 something, and then my mom quickly followed along, I think in 2004, and then they both moved and immigrated to Vancouver in 2006.
I am also Chinese Canadian. I was born and raised in Vancouver, Canada, but both my parents are Chinese. My mom was born in Chengdu, so she grew up speaking Mandarin, but when she got with my dad, she learned Cantonese, and my dad is from Guangzhou, so he speaks only Cantonese, but he was born in Vietnam, so his immigration story is actually quite interesting. He was a refugee, and he was like one of the people who were considered the boat people, and at first he found himself in Malaysia for a couple years before he actually immigrated to Canada. And my mom was a Chinese immigrant that later found him and they crossed paths, and then now there's me. So yeah.
Cute.
So I'm, again, as well, Chinese Canadian. I was born in Canada, but my mom immigrated here in 2002, and I have an older brother who was born in China but immigrated with my mom. But even till now, my dad is still in China, and it's just me and my mom here in Canada.
So clearly we kind of have a lot of similar experiences, but I think also very different ones. Like, all of us are Chinese Canadian. That's something that we all have in common, but definitely, like, in terms of specific heritages, each of us kind of like differ in that sense. So that's why I wanted to invite this group of people. Also, they're some of my favorite people in the world. They're some of my closest friends. So yeah. But talking about a bit about microaggressions, obviously that's a huge topic to navigate and a huge pill to swallow. But I'm gonna talk a little bit about my experiences and kind of my first encounters with it. So I think the first time I really encountered, I guess, like, microaggressions or racism was in the 3rd grade. So this was in elementary school, and I believe, like, there were probably maybe only 2 other Chinese students in my grade during that time. Like, I think there was one Filipino guy and like a Japanese guy, and like that was like literally it. I don't know if it was similar for you guys, in terms of like your elementary schools, if there was like a huge Asian population, but for me, it was like a mainly like white suburban neighborhood, so there was just like literally nothing. And basically, I remember during recess or playtime, that we were like playing a school game outside, and then people would pull their eyes back in like different directions and be like, oh, Chinese, Japanese, etc. I feel like you guys probably know what I'm talking about. And it was supposed to be representing different Asian cultures in terms of like their eye shapes. And oddly enough, like when you're in the 3rd grade, you don't really have a strong concept of race. No shit. Because like you're just like popped out of the womb. Not literally, but like, you know what I mean? I don't think anyone goes into the world being like so on and so forth. So you don't really have a strong concept of race, let alone racism. So back then, I feel like I just viewed people as is, right? Just as people. And if you did have kind of a concept of racism, it would be something that would likely be taught. Like, it would be a taught concept, right? Because you're still a kid. But like any other kid, I just viewed it as if like it was another game. Like, I thought it was like tag or Foursquare or whatever, right? And I didn't really know that there were underlying like microaggressions in that game. But even then, even though I was in the 3rd grade, I didn't have a concept of like what racism is. I didn't really know what race was. Like, I still had a feeling that something was wrong, even though I didn't know exactly what was wrong with it. So talking about that experience, like, do you guys, you know, have an experience of like being the only Asian or like a small like minority at your school of like Asian peoples, or feeling out of place, like even just like in society? Or it doesn't even have to be like microaggressions that you encountered when you were really young, just like microaggressions that maybe you guys experience in the day-to-day.
I think for all of us it was different, because I grew up in Richmond, which, if you know, is very like Asian Chinese dominated. But then Tiffany grew up in China. No, not grew up in China, but like,
I went back to China for 3 years in grade 1, grade 2, and kindergarten. But after grade 3, I did come back to Vancouver.
Most of my elementary school life, I went to a private school with a very big Asian population. So I will say I haven't had many of those like microaggressive experiences when I was younger. But I will say, like, I grew up very quote unquote whitewashed. So like around like different family gatherings and stuff, like I would always be seen as like, I would be called like, oh, the little white girl in like Cantonese, but that's what they would say, right? I think what I wanted to say was, because I grew up around all these like Chinese aunties and uncles who are always like shaming me for being so quote unquote whitewashed, it almost made me like feel disconnected from my culture. Like, I didn't want to be Chinese because they were over here like shaming me, right? Because of that, I grew up really disconnected from my culture, and almost like I didn't want to be Chinese, and I didn't really put an effort into like learning the language too. And it was harder for me because my household spoke both Cantonese and Mandarin. So my mom saw this and put me in like Mandarin lessons for literally like 7 years of my life. I don't think I stopped until like recent years. But like, I was always so like, I didn't want to learn it. Like, I'd be in class and I'd be dreading it. And then, like, you know, like, there's stereotypes of, like, you know, my mom just, like, sitting with me at the dinner table, pushing me to finish my homework, but, like, I didn't want to do it, right? But it wasn't until, like, I became a teenager that I realized, like, the importance of actually, like, appreciating your culture and learning your language. And I feel like because I didn't see that as a kid, it's harder for me now that I'm older.
Do you feel like that regret kind of like stemmed onto you? Because like, I don't think you would have felt that way, like, oh, you know, learning my culture or like learning my home, like mother tongue or whatever is like a burden, if you weren't shamed for it early on, right? So like, do you feel like because you were shamed for it early on, like you weren't Chinese enough or whatever, so you were kind of like almost playing into that stereotype, like a anti-hero, like fuck you kind of thing, like, oh, if I'm not Chinese enough, then I'm just not gonna learn it, or like, oh, it's a chore now to learn it because you guys are shaming me for not being whatever enough.
Yeah, that's like exactly how I felt. And also like I grew up just like watching a lot of Western cartoons. Like a lot of Chinese kids, they grow up watching like really popular Chinese cartoons. Like I never had that. My childhood was very westernized, and on top of like all these people shaming me for not being quote unquote Chinese enough, it just made me all in all like not want to associate myself with that at all. I was like, oh, I'm gonna grow up and I'm gonna, stay in Canada or live in America. Like I'm not gonna need to like learn the language. I'm never gonna go back to China. That was kind of my mindset.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like we're talking a lot about like childhood experiences, but also like we experienced not too long ago like the whole COVID-19 pandemic, right? And that definitely affected every single person in the Asian community. Like it was definitely a shocker to everyone in the community. And I think the rise of microaggressions, the rise of like common day-to-day racism like was very much perpetuated. I mean, like, I remember, like, being on my phone and literally not being able to go on it because I didn't want to see, like, old Asian women or, like, whatever being harassed on the street because it was just such a common day-to-day occurrence that a lot of Asian people were being blamed for the pandemic, right? And obviously that's, like, a grander showcase of, like, racism in our day-to-day society. But, like, have you guys ever... I guess like recently experienced a sense of like microaggressions, or have you recently experienced a play of racism? We were talking about earlier on in the episode how like when I bring up my experience of my first encounter with like microaggressions and my first encounter with racism, like I didn't even really have a conceptual thought of like, yes, this is racism. I just knew like, hey, something's wrong about this. I feel a little bullied, right? So growing up now where you're able to like actually conceptualize the idea of microaggressions, where you're actually able to conceptualize the idea of like racism, have you encountered anything in a way where you've been able to recognize, hey, this isn't just wrong, but it's also like an attack on my culture?
I also had an experience with this kid at my elementary school, but it's weird because he's also Asian, he's Korean, but I'm Chinese, and during the time of around COVID, he randomly started attacking me and started saying like, calling me slurs. Actually, calling me slurs for black people, which doesn't make any sense actually. But also alongside that, he would also say like, "Oh, bat eater. Oh, go back to your country." It just doesn't really make sense to me because he's also Asian. So I think that's just really ironic.
Yeah, but it also just goes to show, like, with the rise of social media and with, like, our 21st century, like, kind of modernizing in terms of technology, how easy it is and how, like, anyone can be just, like, hateful on the day-to-day, right? Like, it doesn't take anything out of them, right? But then, obviously, even though it's just, like, a couple of words or a couple of actions, it obviously still hurts you as a person, right? So, while we move into the next segment, I also think that beauty standards and growing up subconsciously played a role into wanting to feel more white or wanting to be more like our white counterparts, despite the fact that I was Asian. So like an example of this that I just thought about would be Barbie. Like growing up, I loved playing with Barbies. I had so many. I had like the different dream houses and like clothes and like whatever. I literally remember one time showing up to a dinner with my full Barbie suitcase and just like playing with them at the table. So I was obsessed with Barbies. But as we know, like Barbie in herself is inherently white and portraying the stereotypical American beauty with blue eyes and blonde hair. And like, if we're speaking about Barbie specifically, I think the only real representation that I had at the time or was exposed to was Rochelle from Barbie. Barbie Life in a Dream House. I don't know if you guys remember her, but Rochelle, I don't know. But even then, like, I don't even know if she was actually Asian, despite having black hair and brown eyes. There was no really, like, distinctive feature about her that made me feel as though, oh yeah, like, me in the 3rd grade as a little girl would have representation in that world. Compiled with the fact that she was constantly portrayed as being the unliked character or the villain that was constantly flopping or doing everything wrong. And it just didn't really help to be compared to Barbie, who had like a bajillion different jobs, a perfect boyfriend, a perfect house, so on and so forth. So I think because of that, compiled with the fact that I went to a primarily white elementary school, subconsciously, I think I always believed that in a way, like, people who looked like Barbie or, people with more European features or people who were more white portraying, like, were almost better than me. even if that wasn't really the case. So, like, talking about growing up, it doesn't even have to be growing up, but just like in the day to day. I know definitely it's getting better now, but in media, do you feel like you had a true sense of representation growing up throughout your childhood?
I think growing up, due to the lack of representation in Western media, I never really was attracted to it anyways, and I never looked for it because I would rather just go and watch and connect with Chinese media where I can truly see representation because everybody is just Chinese.
Yeah, but it's also just sad that, like, oh, you literally can't find representation in Western media, so you're just opting to look for Chinese media instead because you know that there will be a lack thereof or none at all, right? So I think, like, Tiffany brought up a great point in terms of, like, you know, there was really a lack of representation in Western media, and that's why she opted for Chinese media instead. But even if we take a look at media in the Western sphere, there's not a lot of Asian representation. Like, some of my favorite musicians are Asian, like Nicki or Olivia Rodrigo or Rosé. But that said, a lot of these people can't really be compared to their white counterparts. So an example of this is I love and adore Nicki's music. Like, Lala Lost You has literally been a comfort song of mine for years. But you can't really compare Nicki or Conan Gray to the same success in the way that you do Taylor Swift or Britney Spears, or vice versa, right? And Olivia Rodrigo, like, she's an artist that's popping off at the moment, like, everyone loves her. But despite that, she's also incredibly white passing. Like, I wouldn't look at her and my first thought would be, oh yeah, she's Filipino. And that's not to take away from her heritage or who she is, but it is to say that, like, you know, she does have more Eurocentric features. And I don't know if that's like a play in her success, but it is just like an observation, right? And Rosé, who's like an incredibly talented musician, is originally from the K-pop industry. And that's not to discredit any of these artists, because each of them are extremely, extremely talented in their own ways. But the point that I'm trying to get across is that it's much harder for Asian people to solidify their place in a Western market where majority of the people at the top are white people or people with Eurocentric features or play more into the white beauty standard, right? Like, to this day, we have K-pop artists that are making a name for themselves, right? We have Rosé, we have BTS, we have Blackpink, and they're still being discredited to this day for being too K-pop in terms of, like, Western mainstream audiences, or to people, like, back home in Korea, like, they're being seen as, like, oh, they're almost selling themselves out to reach a Western market, right? Rather than just seeing them as artists for what they are. Because I've never really heard that same, like, attribute for other artists or, like, their white counterparts is basically what I'm trying to say. And it's just sad because, like, a lot of these people won't even give these artists a chance, like these K-pop artists a chance, because of the fact that they're deemed as foreign to Western audiences in the first place. And it's just sad because it's like these artists that only because they're Asian or only because they're from a different culture, so K-pop music, right, they're looked at with such scrutiny in comparison to other artists.
I feel like, especially in the world of K-pop, when K-pop was first breaking out in the Western world, there were still, like, a lot of people on, like, the Western side just, like, kind of taking it as a joke and, like, making fun of it and being like, oh, like, why are they pronouncing things weird? They all look the same, or, like, just, like, calling them, like, those K-pop people. And I know now it has gotten a lot better since K-pop is a lot more globalized with groups like New Jeans and stuff. But when it was first breaking out, like, just BTS, like, a lot of it was taken as a joke. And, like, with, like, Twice and stuff, like, when they sang Feel Special, they would, like, make fun of their accents and stuff. So I feel like that's a really interesting point to talk about.
I think the divide is very interesting because back then it was a very, like, you either love K-pop or you hate it. But now for sure there's more, like, with, like, 50-50, like, New Jeans, they have songs that even just, like, people who maybe used to even hate on K-pop would listen to now.
Yeah, I also feel like within media in general, it's so much harder for a person of color to just gain recognition within the mainstream space in comparison to their white counterparts. So an example of this is something that Dustin Vuong brings to the table in his video. He states that people of color have to work way harder to be successful in comparison to a white or white passing person. For example, just recently we had Michelle Yeoh kind of win an Oscar for Best Actress for Everything Everywhere All at Once. And that was a huge win for Asian Canadians, Asian Americans, and Asian people in general. She stated, "For all the little boys and girls who look like me that are watching tonight, this is a beacon of hope and possibilities. This is the roof of dreams this is proof that dreams do come true." In which Michelle Yeoh was only second out of 2 Asian actors to be nominated for the Best Actress category in the nearly 10-decade history of Oscars. Of course, many flowers to Michelle Yeoh for being an icon within the Asian community, but that does show how difficult it is for not only people of color representation to happen in the first place, but also for people of color to be seen in the same notoriety as their white counterparts. And even though we do have that win, oftentimes Asian achievements are overlooked or swept under the rug due to the stereotypes of Asians being considered the model minority. An example of this would be the point that Asians are really smart, or Asians are good at math, or even though those stereotypes are considered quote-unquote good stereotypes to have, these stereotypes place a downwards pressure on Asian people. Like, if they don't follow under these categories, then they're deemed failures. Additionally, it takes away from the hard work that has been put in, the achievements of Asian people, for example, discrediting work ethic or striving for success on the basis of these stereotypes. Society, in turn, has effectively found a way to not only make it harder for people of color to find success, but when they do, it's discredited and devalued to the fact that, well, you're Asian, as if the work you put in didn't come with any struggles whatsoever. So how do you guys feel about these stereotypes? Do you feel like they harmfully negate your work? I know a lot of you guys are applying for universities during this time right now, so, talk a little bit about your experiences. Do you feel like it gives you an advantage or a disadvantage?
So I have an interesting perspective since I'm an art kid. I'm a visual artist, and I'm applying for architecture. But my point is that as an Asian individual, I've always had the pressure from even my parents, who do also, I think the stereotype comes from an older generation who believes that who pressure their children to be super academically strong. So then everyone sees that and it's like, oh, Asian people are all so academically smart because their parents are so pressuring, But for me, since I started going into art, my parents still put pressure on me, but probably less than what other people would expect. So then I wouldn't say I have horrible grades, but obviously I'm more focused on my art. Growing up, since I started being sure that I want to go into art, when people would ask me oh, what are you going into, they'd expect me to say something like science or business. But obviously when I say oh, I'm going to art, I'm going to architecture, they're like, oh, that's interesting, did your parents approve of that? And it's very, I would say it's a little discrediting because I put in a lot of effort with my art, and I want to be recognized that I am an artist, and it doesn't even matter if my parents approve it or not. As long as I'm putting the work in and I'm a good artist, that should be enough.
I think there's also this idea of trauma playing a fact into certain career paths or whatever to be better than. So for example, if you meet a comp sci major that literally hasn't slept in 8 hours or whatever, it's almost seen as a flex rather than oh, actually that's really concerning and you should probably get some sleep. And it's just I don't like this idea of trauma being as a way to negate who is better. For example, art majors are looked down upon because, oh, all they have to do is draw and color. But for me, for example, I'm a business major who loves my creative passions. I love art, I love doing it, I love this podcast, right? But there was a clear, definite reason why I didn't want to go into the arts, and that's just because I don't want to turn my creative passions into work, because I know that me as a person, that would make me so depressed, having to turn something I love doing, for example drawing or painting, into, oh, I need to make a certain quota of these pieces. I need to do it by this specific deadline. I know me as a person, I would not be able to do that just because like I don't have enough creative fuel to be constantly thinking of new ideas. And I think like people discredit like art majors, for example, even though it does take not only a lot of physical work in the sense where you're literally drawing out everything you're doing, but also like emotional work in the sense where you're putting your own soul into every single piece you're making, or like every piece you're making. Maybe it's not like the most brilliant, like jaw-dropping, societally breaking idea, but you're still taking the time to conceptually think about it and like put in your thoughts and effort, right? While like a comp sci major, yeah, you're coding for hours, you're putting a lot of hard work in, there's like a lot of hard math or like courses that you have to take, right? But that does not make you better in society than someone who is an art major or whatever. And I feel like as a collective, we need to stop like thinking, oh, certain majors or certain career paths or whatever are worse. It's just the fact that, hey, they are career paths, and the person who makes it or breaks it, like, is what matters, right? If I'm an art major and I work my ass off and I become a famous artist in the future or whatever, right? That speaks for itself than if I'm a comp sci major and I don't do anything with my life and I never turn in my assignments or whatever, right? So, like, yeah, I don't really know what I'm trying to say, but people shouldn't be shitting on you.
So I'm also applying for universities, and I go on the opposite side. I'm going to a science major. It's kind of solidified now because I recently got an offer from the school that I want to go to for a bachelor's of science. And I think throughout high school, like anywhere from grade 10 till now, all my courses have been very like STEM based, like chemistry and math and physics and all these other kinds of like really, what's the word, like intensive kind of course that you kind of expect an Asian to take. So every time people ask like, oh, what do you want to go into? I'll be like, oh, I want to go into science. And then people like, they kind of just have that reaction where it's like, oh, I knew it. And I don't know, just something about that makes me feel like weird, like strange, like what do you mean that you knew it? And it can come from someone who like isn't from an Asian background, and then it's like, well, what are you trying to implement, what are you trying to say? So I don't know, my parents have always approved of like my choice of career, but then I always think about like, what if they didn't? Like, let's say I wanted to go into something else, I wanted to go into something of the arts, something English based, but then what would they think? Because they've always had the experience that they've always had the mindset that like, oh, Asians should go into something STEM related.
I also think with that, like, people kind of stating like, oh yeah, like that's expected of you to go into the sciences, or that's expected of you to choose that career path. It almost discredits your ability within that career path itself. Like, for example, you're only choosing that career path because your background defines you or dictates you to do so. Like, because you're Asian or you have a Chinese heritage, oh yeah, it's like no shit that you would go into sciences, or no shit that you would go into the maths or whatever, right? Rather than thinking of you as a person, of like who you are. So like what I mean by that is like, oh, you have a genuine love for the sciences and you have a genuine love for that kind of stratosphere, right? Rather than seeing it like that, like, hey, this is a really hardworking person and this is something they genuinely love, they're negating it simply just to like, oh yeah, she's Asian, so that's to be expected of. And I think that like definitely does not showcase who you are as a person. So even within Hollywood and media, Dustin Vuong in his video, Let's Talk About Growing Up Asian American, mentioned big Hollywood actors such as Henry Golding in Crazy Rich Asians. He talks about trends in the Hollywood industry of provoking a means of diversity and inclusion for Asian audiences, only to end up casting Asian actors to play the love interest, or the more superior role. And even though, yes, this is, I guess, a form of representation, it is almost a backwards way of profiting off marginalized communities from the viewpoint of a Western eye. An Asian with Eurocentric features playing the golden love interest is essentially what passes, because when you are an Asian with Eurocentric features, only then will you be considered pretty or handsome enough to obtain these superior roles. And this isn't to say that Asian actors aren't deserving of these roles, but what we're saying is that movies dedicated to or trying to have proper Asian representation within them shouldn't dominantly be Asian as a result, because they aren't properly portraying the Asian experience. So have you guys seen this within mainstream media where Asians or Asians with Eurocentric features are more heavily praised compared to those with stereotypical features? And how do you feel about this issue?
I feel like for a lot of Asian American actresses and actors, they get casted in like movies and shows like Kim Convenience and Fresh Off the Boat, Crazy Rich Asians, where it's almost like their entire role is just centered around being Asian, and it's not really like an actual serious role where people are taking them seriously.
When Asian people get casted for roles in movies and stuff, their kind of whole thing is that they are Asian. They don't really, there's not much of like more, there's not a lot more to their character. Their main thing, the main thing about their character is often just that they are Asian. There's not anything about like, oh, who they are, who their personality, where they're like their story kind of thing, unless it's Asian related.
And it's almost like they're capitalizing off our culture, and it's almost like being Asian is seen more as a costume rather than a part of like who we are, right? Because yes, we are Asian, but we're so much more than that. A lot of Asian people are also daughters, a lot of Asian people are also mothers, and so on and so forth, right? And like when that is highlighted, like who the person actually is in these stories, rather than the fact that, oh, they are Asian and they come from an Asian background, that is more telling to the character. But the fact that, you know, we have to almost put on our heritage as if it's a costume, whether it be through our looks, whether it be through accents, and so on and so forth. It almost like mocks the Asian culture and almost makes it seem as if like we aren't good enough just as people. Like we almost have to play up our own stereotypes to be considered worthwhile or being entertainment almost.
I think the whole point I'm trying to get at is that if the character doesn't need to be Asian, then they won't be Asian. They will cast a white actor. It's only if the character has a background story of them being Asian, then they'll take in an Asian person. But otherwise, they wouldn't just cast an Asian person just because.
I think the media has portrayed this idea that you can only be deemed as pretty or praised by society if you fall into Western beauty standards. Like, for me specifically, looking at representation within media, I mentioned previously Barbie. And a lot of times I've considered getting cosmetic enhancements to fix facial features of mine that aren't really considered white or Eurocentric. These are features that are my more Asian-looking features. And this would be things like to try to get a higher nose bridge, or to have that desired button nose effect, or to have higher cheekbones or slimmer jaw. Now, of course, things have changed, and I've been able to become happy with my features and the way that they are, but it took a lot of growth to be able to get to that point. And even there's times where I'll have my off days. And I think that just shows how much the media forces unrealistic standards onto so many people. Even when the beauty standards aren't necessarily a feature-focused thing, but things such as having paler skin in Asia is seen as so much more attractive and desirable, whilst in America, it's more so that people want to be seen as tan and glowy. So those contradicting beauty standards and the standard in general just makes it feel as if though we can never really win. And it's just crazy how, you know, a lot of these current beauty standards are still rooted within these old ideals of colonization and European futures. It's hard to believe that you are inherently beautiful and that you should give yourself grace when the next cosmetic enhancement or next standard is coming out day to day. So how do you guys feel that Western or Asian beauty standards affects you? Has it affected you?
Personally, when it comes to Asian beauty standards, I kind of don't fit into a lot of it. I have the mono eyelid, which Asian beauty standards like double eyelids. Now that as I grow up, like I'm getting more double eyelided. I don't know why. I think it's just, I don't know. I don't know. I can't, do I have double eyelids right now?
Like slight.
Yeah, slight. Okay, but yeah, like at home, I don't know why I have monolids, and they've always been like looked down upon. Every time I would go back to China, and they'd be like, "Oh, you know, double eyelid surgery is like really cheap."
That's insane.
I know, and I'd be like, "Oh, well, thanks." And it's always like the aunties that are divorced and don't have kids. You know, that type of ordeal.
And I just want to touch on that growing up, when I first started caring about my appearance, so like around grade 7 or even grade 6, um, I obviously looked up to like the older grades and kind of the popular kids in the older grades and what they looked like. And for me, I'm sure this is different for everyone, but when I was around that age, there were these like international kids who like we would call FOBs, which stands for fresh off the boat. And there's this it's like a specific aesthetic that they have where they're obviously fluent in Chinese and maybe even not fluent in English. So everything they post would be in Chinese, and as someone who I was fluent in Chinese. I've always been fluent in Chinese and English, but seeing that they were, these popular kids are these international students and they're so like pretty in like an Asian beauty standard way, that turned out to be what I wanted for myself back then. And even now I think it shows in my style and my aesthetic now. But I just think that it's interesting everyone probably has a different aesthetic that they looked up to since they were really young, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I totally get that. Like, I remember when, like, the Au-Yeung aesthetic and everything was popping off on Instagram, and definitely, like, this idea of a lot of international students going out and kind of portraying this aesthetic was super prevalent. And I remember, like, a lot of my friend group, like, you included, Tiffany, were, like, also kind of within that hemisphere. So it definitely perpetuated this idea that, like, oh, I want to be more Chinese appearing. And I literally remember, like, going on my, Google Translate when I would be at a cafe or something and being like cafe and then copy pasting the Chinese and putting just cafe heart or something, like cafe heart emoji and some rando like Chinese song, but it would be like this old Chinese musician, because like those were all the Chinese musicians I knew at the time. Like I didn't know Gong, I didn't know Lexi Liu, like I didn't know these people. I just knew whatever my 70-year-old Asian dad listened to. So it would be like cafe story with some old ass song, and then the caption would literally just be cafe in Chinese, because I didn't actually know how to like type and read and stuff. So, and I thought I was so cool. I was like, damn, I'm really like hitting it. I'm so like oriental right now. Girl, no. Or like, I don't know, just like I remember, oh my god, also wanting to constantly incorporate basically in Chinese media, like there's this slang, so it's like we use numbers for certain acronyms. So like for example, like 我爱你 is like I love you in Chinese, and then like if you put 520, 520 is like 520, which sounds like 我爱你, which is I love you, right? So if you want to say I love you to someone, you can say 520. And I would always use those numbers because I thought it was so cool. And I would like also put like 88888 as like LOL for like ba 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 ba, which is like ha 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 ha. Or like what was another one, like else that I like always did all the time and I spammed constantly on my stories was 永远的神, which is like YYDS, which is like, oh, how do you even, like, you're the goat, basically, like, yeah.
You are, forever God.
You are forever God, yeah, and I would always put Yong in the Shen, or I would put 我操 as walk. Like, I don't know, I remember one time, like, it was really windy or something, and I posted a video of it, and I was like, 我操, which is like, but I put it as, like, walk, and then, like, this international student girl like responded to my story, and she responded in this like whole Chinese paragraph, and I was like, oh my god, I'm not prepared for this. Like this is like 我操 and 永远的神 and 520 is the like cap of my capabilities. Like if you want to actually have a conversation, you gotta go to someone else. So yeah, definitely an experience. Yeah.
I feel like jumping back to the whole beauty standard thing, I feel like recently in Western media, when like portraying Asian beauty, the kind of beauty standard has been ABGs, which stands for Asian baby girl, which obviously had a more deeper history behind it, but then now it's kind of watered down to like a specific aesthetic where it's like they go raving and they have a certain makeup style, like heavy makeup, lashes, they like boba, go to seaside, you know, that kind of aesthetic. And I feel like that's kind of what's considered pretty or beautiful if you're Asian. And I always found this really interesting because like when it comes to white girls that are like pretty and beautiful, the kind of aesthetic is like, well, one of the more popular ones is the clean girl aesthetic, where it's like light makeup and like just mascara, no lashes, and like really dewy highlighter. I found it really interesting that it was like the aesthetic for white girls was more clean and natural, whereas for Asians it was like, you know, you're packing on foundation and powder and like heavy lashes. And I was like, why is that? And I was talking to a friend about it, and they were like, oh, you don't think of it, but it's like, it's because it's hiding the Asian features. And I found that really interesting to think about, because like obviously like you're like, oh, you're thinking too deep into it, but honestly like it is true in a sense.
And I think it also like portrays like almost this idea, like going back to the media portrayal thing, how we were talking about like different Barbie characters being portrayed as like the villains when they are Asian presenting, or like, but in comparison like white counterparts are seen as like the more superior role or stuff. And it's kind of this idea here as well, with like, you know, aesthetics being primarily like drawn to Eurocentric features being portrayed as more clean or like more desirable, while like, you know, you mentioned like ABGs like oftentimes like pack on heavy lashes or like thick foundation or stuff, and they're almost like seen as like lesser than or like more ratchet or like slutty or whatever, when that's like not the case whatsoever, and it's simply just like a makeup style. Like that's it for what it is. And I also see like a lot of like parodies of like, you know, guys like pretending to be the Kevin Nguyen and then like girls being the ABG and whatever, and then it's like always them like being taken out on dates or like whatever and like not really being into it, or like all they do is just clubbing, like raves and boba and like all of this stuff, while like the clean girl aesthetic is associated with, you know, lifestyle and getting your life together and self-care. And I just think that dichotomy is really different, and how we kind of praise the white woman in a way while bringing down Asian women.
I feel like the reason why the whole ABG aesthetic has had its big breakthrough lately is because it's seen as more bold and empowering, and it's like you wouldn't expect like an Asian woman to kind of have this like aesthetic going on where it's like centered around like raving and like clubbing and like kind of that whole like I don't give a fuck personality, whereas like previously, before all this aesthetic, they're seen as like timid and shy, and like, you know, they don't really have like a say in like who they are or like what they want to portray.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. And like going back to the double standards, specifically in relation to beauty standards and how there's polarizing beauty standards in terms of Asia versus the West. I know with this group specifically, we've had so many conversations about how we feel specifically lost in between our two cultures, and more so between our two identities. And with this group specifically, like, we can speak all of our cultural languages to an extent, so whether this be Mandarin or Cantonese or both. And there's instances where we'll be able to pick up on jokes or references from Chinese media. So, you know, in that way, like, we're not necessarily whitewashed because we are aware and we are integrated into our culture to a good extent. But that said, like, growing up in Canada, being a Canadian citizen has made it difficult to fully immerse ourselves into Chinese culture because of our upbringing. Like, because of who we are and because of where we're born, we're obviously going to have Western influences or societies influencing our morals, beliefs, or values, and how we even think from a day to day. So how do you feel between those two polarizing worlds having played an influence in your day-to-day life? Not really being white enough to fit into your white counterparts, and, you know, obviously we aren't white people, so you're never going to be seen as a white person because we're not white. But physically never really being the same, but also not directly being from the motherland makes us question oneself about being Asian enough.
Personally, when we go out into very like Asian dominated like areas such as like Richmond or like just anywhere else that's really Asian dominated or in like a public space, this actually happened a few days ago, but I was grocery shopping in like a Asian supermarket, and I was buying this like skincare thing or whatever, and the cashier looked at me, Asian, and I'm also Asian, and responded to me in English. And then I was just like, do these, like, does the older generation look at the younger generation and think that, like, oh, we don't know Chinese, we don't know this language, that language? And I don't know, it felt like kind of sad in a way. I used this on my application when I was applying to universities. I said I felt too foreign to be Canadian, yet too Western to be Chinese. Because I've always had that language barrier where I can understand and speak Mandarin to a certain level, but I can't really read, I can't really write, versus English I'm fluent in. But then there's still those like instances where I don't know what the word is unless I say it in Mandarin.
I think what you're trying to say, it's just like contradicting, because it's like you feel like you mentioned, like you feel like a foreigner within the Western society, but you're not like foreign enough for your motherland. And I think that definitely speaks volumes, because it's like, you know, with English, it's like, yes, this is something that you're fluent with, but sometimes there's like Mandarin influences that you want to bring up that you're not able to express in an English vocabulary, and vice versa. Like you have thoughts and feelings, like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, when I was doing the prayer towards my grandma and grandpa. Like at first, like with a day-to-day vocabulary, I was able to explain like what's currently going on in my life, but as the prayer went on and I wanted to like express feelings of like love and like more like deeper, more complex emotions, like I wasn't able to do that within Cantonese. So I think it's just like this roadblock of like, oh, you know, where do I really belong? Because there's no true community for me. And I think that's where we kind of like make a community for ourselves. Like this is why like this friend group has been so important to me, where we're all kind of alike, where it's like, yeah, we do have these Asian influences in our life, but in a way we're also very Westernized. So I think like that's where, you know, if there is no community for you, you kind of make it for yourself.
I feel like as someone who has had both white and Asian love interests, I always felt a need to like fit a mold and like change myself in a way to appear more likable to whoever I was talking to. Like say if I was talking to like a white guy, I'd be like, oh, do you think like my makeup's not heavy enough? Should I put on like bigger lashes? Should I dye my hair blonde? Whereas like say if I was talking to a more international student, kind of Chinese guy, I'd be like, oh, like what if my Chinese isn't good enough for him? Like what if I'm too whitewashed? What if like my interests are just too Western for him? And I feel like that kind of had a really big effect on me as a teenager growing up. I kind of had to bounce back and forth between like fitting this type of mold where like I kind of lost myself, not really knowing like what is authentically me.
Yeah, and I also think it works as a double-edged sword in the way where like you know, for me specifically, like I gravitated towards people of color, and I can say that without a doubt, like majority of my friends are people of color. And that's not to say I went into those relationships or like those friendships with the idea that like, oh, I'm only gonna make friends with people of color, and so on and so forth. But it was more so that I naturally gravitated towards these people of color because I inherently knew that like we have fundamentally similar experiences. And I think like within the 8th grade specifically, like I tried to connect more so with my culture, just like meeting more people within my community or those that were just similar to myself. And I think with all of us, like coming from, you know, one point in our lives being ingrained with K-pop pretty heavily, like that's where a lot of us were able to nurture and grow our friendships in a way. But I remember one time I had gone to a dance class, and everyone, if not majority of the people there, were Chinese, and the only difference for myself was that they were directly from China. So they were way more in tune with their cultures in a way where all of them could speak their mother tongue fluently, understand cultural references, memes, or jokes, or slangs. Just things that I didn't really understand. And growing up in a Cantonese household, like, of course I was exposed to my culture, but we weren't using day-to-day slang that someone within my age group would be saying in China, but more so talking about things like chores or daily inferences. So to be suddenly thrown into that environment, I felt extremely out of place. I almost felt like I wasn't Asian enough to be there. I tried to make it work with like my broken Cantonese, but you could definitely tell that I was an outsider. And that experience just spoke so much to me because of the fact that for majority of my life, like I would connect to other people of color to find a sense of safety, right? Or at least a mutual understanding. But in a room filled with other Chinese people, people from my own culture, I felt like a foreigner. So have you ever felt an instance where, you know, you were kind of a foreigner within your own culture? And how did you deal with those feelings of inadequacy, like, if ever?
Definitely had that feeling quite a few times, especially when I go back and visit China and I'm talking to like salespeople or like waiters and stuff. I like speak to them in Chinese for a while, and then like the question pops up and it's like, oh, did you grow up in Canada or in America? And it's like, oh, they know, they like see me, they see the way I talk, the way I dress, and it's like they know that I'm not quote unquote one of them. And that kind of always, I guess, made me feel a bit sad on the inside, how it's like, oh, I can talk to someone for like, 2 minutes and they already know that I'm an outsider.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
So I wanted to add on because I can't exactly relate because I haven't been back in China in over 5 years, I'd say. I think even 6 years. But I have a trip planned to go back to China in 2 months. And I feel pressured that I feel scared that I'm gonna experience what Chloe is mentioning, where I go back and immediately people are like, oh, she just came back from Canada, like she's not one of us, like, and like all the aunties and stuff saying like, oh, you should have, why don't you know how to speak as much Mandarin as you used to, or whatever. I feel more pressured to know Mandarin better and be more in tune with my culture.
So going back to those times in grade 8 where I tried to pertain more to my heritage and my culture, during those times I definitely also pushed myself to fall under the mold of Asian beauty standards, one of which was the idea to be paler in order to achieve the female Asian beauty standard. Those standards are heavily influenced by the ideal of the European figure, and findings have stated that many of these beauty influences derive from European colonization. In Asia, it's said to be that having darker skin or more tan skin is seen as lower class, and to have lighter skin was a way of civilizing and humanizing people of color, to be able to be viewed as the same as their white counterparts. Asian beauty standards have been heavily impacted by their European imperialism, and even to this day is still being employed. The crazy thing is that Western beauty standards conflict with Asian beauty standards. In the West, like previously mentioned, it's more popular to have more voluptuous figures, to have more curves, to be tanner, to have glowing skin, while in the East, having a smaller figure and having whiter or paler skin is more desirable. However, there's also a lot of overlapping beauty standards that derive from Eurocentric ideas. The example of having large eyes, a small nose bridge, high cheekbones, and so forth. That said, having to deal with these conflicting beauty standards was absolutely a mind warp growing up. Previously, when I was younger, I wanted to be able to exemplify the Western beauty standard, to be able to have more glowy tan skin, to be taller and have a more model-like figure, to be blonde with blue eyes. But as I grew older, I found myself dealing with the feelings of inadequacy and wanting to appear more Asian, only to be met with the harsh Asian beauty standards. And overall, it just felt as if there was no winning. Specifically within the journal, The Occidentalization of Beauty Standards, Eurocentrism in Asia, they state that the surge of European beauty standards was heavily influenced by the rise of social media, with technology becoming a part of our day-to-day. Now more than ever, we are being exposed to the newest or latest trends, whether it be the fox eye trend, how your collarbones look, and need to be straight in order to present an elegant figure, the ins and outs of beauty we see in our day-to-day. Take, for example, the BBLs, the filler effects in 2016 to 2019, that has exposed many young women to various products to enhance beauty features. Ads such as plastic surgery, especially the double eyelid surgery, like Audrey mentioned previously. The rise of these practices and the accessibility visibility of them are visibly affecting societal norms within these countries, as beauty standards are slowly starting to shift towards a more Eurocentric look. I mean, we see it in our day-to-day. Now more than ever, plastic surgery is being praised for what it can do. And in East Asian countries specifically, it is so normalized. Cosmetic enhancements are seen as gifts to be given when girls turn of age. There's so many cosmetic enhancements that are being introduced every single day that they're making new insecurities of it every single day as well over nothing. An example of this would be the double eyelid surgery, where in Korea, nearly 50% of women in their 20s undergo this procedure to be able to achieve a more youthful look. That is highly praised. With media playing a prevalent part and being more accessible each day, it's toxic to be constantly surrounded by beauty standards that are actually achievable if you decide to splurge on the next new product or decide to go under the knife. So with that said, I know that was a lot of yapping, but how do you guys feel about these polarizing beauty standards? Have they affected you? And do you feel like the East Asian beauty standards or Western beauty standards have affected the way you portray yourself? How does this characterize or play a part in your identity and the way you present yourself to the rest of the world?
Actually, speaking of double eyelids, I know we've mentioned it a lot of times, but I also have to mention my story with double eyelids, because since I was really young, I always thought that I wanted double eyelids. Like, since I was like probably in like grade 4 maybe. And it was always like, oh, once I turn 18, it's going to be my birthday gift. My mom's going to bring me back to China or Korea and get me double eyelid surgery. And all the way up until like last year maybe, I've been like waiting for the day that I can go back to China over the break and like get the surgery. But actually, I probably could have last year, but I've come to accept my features more, and I honestly don't think I will ever get double eyelid surgery anymore, even though it's like something ever since I was super young always wanted to get. And I just think it's really interesting how, like, even though I've always wanted it, maybe, I don't know what it is, maybe it's that I can see that I don't need it to be pretty, and I've grown out of the beauty standard or something of that sort. But yeah, I just think it's interesting that it is prevalent that double eyelids is such a standard, and getting it as a gift is like something that even I experience, right?
I feel like in terms of beauty standards, it's also really apparent in like Korean and Chinese makeup brands, and where like a lot of, because Korean foundations are really popular lately because they have their cushions, right? But the shade ranges are so limited, and me personally, I have in most brands the darkest shade, which is 23. And you know, sometimes I go on vacation to like maybe someplace that's a bit hotter, and then I get more tan, and I'm always like, oh, like I'm so like I'm always so scared of getting tanner on vacation, because I know that like if I do get even like one shade darker, like there's not gonna be a foundation shade for me. And I know now there's like tier 2, which has like over 20 shades, but then like even just a year back, like brands like Clio, there were like 4 shades to choose from. And I feel like it's really harming, especially on younger generations. They like get into makeup, get into beauty, and then they see there's like 4 shades to choose from, and they're like, oh, like none of those are for me. Like, does that mean like there's something wrong with my skin tone? Am I like not, do I have to be paler to be pretty? You know, this kind of thing.
And I think like even growing up, like I mentioned, all of us kind of had like a little phase where we tried to present more like our international friends or like whatever. Like we literally had a phase where we were like whitening our skin on like Chinese like editing softwares, or like literally like purposely like Chloe mentioned, like there's like literally only 4 shades to choose from within like Korean or Chinese beauty, right? So like oftentimes we would be using foundation shades that are like 5 shades lighter for us, and then like our necks would literally be a different color, and you would just be like, oh, haha, it's just contour. But it's like, gang, I don't know contour that goes across your whole body and not your face. Like, damn, that's a bit of a stretch. But yeah, no, definitely, like it's definitely difficult. And I think like dealing with the polarizing beauty standards that kind of run our world like is difficult, especially when you're growing up. You're definitely having these like insecurities, and you're wondering, you know, what is wrong with me, or is there something wrong with me?
going outside of like the cosmetic and makeup side of things, Asians evolutionarily, we have like smaller nose bridges, we have flatter noses, flatter and wider noses. So especially when it comes to like glasses and sunglasses, trying not to fall off our face, it is so hard to find these brands where they make these glasses that are suitable for Asian noses. So I'm very appreciative to like brands like Gentle Monster and even like Prada that make these glasses like designated for Asian noses, because I can't tell you how many times I have to pull my glasses up when driving, and it's so annoying and kind of honestly sad to see that like these brands have to design different sunglasses for a different minority.
Yeah, it's like rather than being exclusive, or sorry, rather than being inclusive and like, you know, thinking about the various consumers that would buy these products, like you have to go out of your way to make, you know, a space for Asian people or people of color. Like, this has nothing to do with beauty standards, but like, for example, like 88 Rising is a label, a music label that was literally created to uplift Asian artists because they noticed that there was a lack of representation within that media space for Asian artists. And I think, of course, like the artists within 88 Rising, like Nicki or Joji or Rich Brian or like so on and so forth, like they are, you know, really great in their own respects, but the fact that we have to go out of our way to make these spaces for us just because we aren't given that inclusivity, we aren't given that diversity, like it really speaks volumes. Additionally, I don't think it's uncommon for Asian households to comment on your weight or your appearance. It's almost a normalized experience to go to your family gathering and hear, oh, you look a little chubbier today, or you've lost a little weight, or vice versa, being praised because you've lost weight. So additionally, it's not uncommon within Asian households to be able for family members to comment on your weight or your appearance. It's almost like a normalized experience to go to your family gathering and hear, oh, you look a little chubby, or you've gained a little weight, or vice versa, being heavily praised because you've lost weight. So with the idea of, you know, having a thin figure being so normalized one's day to day, like people will literally come up to you and be like, oh, you know, you've gained a little bit of weight, or you've lost so much weight, and it's literally compared to like a hello, how are you? Like that's how casual and that's how normalized it is. Recently, East Asian influence has played a huge role regarding mainstream media with the rise of makeup trends, fashion, and so forth. If we take a look at South Korea specifically, the South Korean wave, specifically with BTS, they have become a global economic force, with their NPR stating the 7-member South Korean boy band is creating jobs, billions in revenue, and even moving the needle in terms of South Korea's GDP. If we take a look at the online concert specifically, an online concert held by BTS during the pandemic brought in more than 70 million in ticket and merchandise sales as a result from Vanek Smith. BTS's popularity is fueling tourism in Korea, the study of Korean language, interest in Korean movies, television, fashion, and food. All told, BTS bring in an estimated amount of $5 billion per year to South Korea's economy. That's nearly 0.5% of the country's entire economy. And this is a statement from Vanek Smith, and that's only taking a look at one boy band. There's also been multiple different K-pop groups that have taken mainstream media by the storm. As well, we also have Japan, who is paving the way for animation across the globe. An example of this would be The Boy and the Heron, created by animation legend known for his works with Ghibli Studios, Miyazaki, who has won the Oscar for Best Animated Featured Film. But despite these amazing wins for the Asian community, why is it that so many Asian countries are being condemned politically, but also within the media? Amy, in her video, China Has a Soft Power Deficiency, goes in depth introducing concepts of soft power, having a social influence without relation to means of money or growth or political influence, but rather cultural attractiveness, foreign policy, and political ideals. A study CSIS states that in 2020, 77% of Americans had a favorable impression of South Korea, up from the initial 31% in 2003. So essentially, it's this idea that countries are being looked at in a more favorable light in comparison to, let's say, China or India. And if you're interested in the influences of soft power and what it has to offer, I highly recommend taking a look at that. However, in this episode, we'll be talking about this topic from a more personal lens. With the rise of popularity towards East Asian countries, how does that make you feel being someone who is not attributed to those cultures? I remember with me specifically, I remember a friend opening up to me about how she was faced with an odd encounter. While working in hospitality, she has a name that's specifically unique to her own country. So when she was asked about it by a guest, she had mentioned that her parents were originally from Vietnam, and that's where her name came from. But when she told the guest was met with disappointment. They said, "Oh, really? I thought you were from Japan instead." That said, it's incredibly odd to see fetishization around certain countries, but the condemnation of others, and how often the media favor certain countries over others. So, does this influence the way you see your own culture, or have you had a similar experience?
I think with the rise of East Asian beauty standards, it's really interesting to see the dichotomy between how people treat Japanese trends, Korean trends, and Chinese trends, because when people talk about Japanese trends and Korean trends, that's just that. It's like, oh, Korean makeup, Japanese hair care, Korean nails, and whatnot. But then when people talk about Chinese trends, it's always like, oh, Douyin makeup, Xiaohongshu makeup, which are really popular social media platforms in China, which I find it really interesting that they choose to call it these platforms instead of just calling it what it is, Chinese makeup. And it's almost as if like they are ashamed to put this Chinese title onto it, and they feel like calling it what it is will make it seem less than. That's why they're giving them these names instead. Like, even if you're trying to search up like Chinese nail art instead of like Xiaohongshu nails, the Chinese nail art is literally just gonna come up with nails with like Chinese legs on them and like Chinese colors, whereas like you literally have to search up Douyin nails or Xiaohongshu nails to actually get the result you want. And even then, there's a lot of people rebranding these nails and makeup looks that are originally from Chinese platforms and calling it Korean makeup or Korean nails.
Additionally, to add on to your point, I think with all of us being Asian women, we've experienced fetishization or sexualization to some degree. Like, with myself specifically, there's been times where I've been compared to, like, an anime character in a sexual light, or where guys will talk to me about Asian explicit models without any context. Like, how does those instances make you feel, or have you experienced similar? Like, for me specifically, something that has kind of blown up within the internet, which I think is a little odd, like, currently I'm in a very happy relationship with my wife, aka not my wife, but my boyfriend, but, he is, like, a Asian person, and every single time, like, I'm out in public with him, like, yes, I wouldn't say necessarily he is white passing, like, I wouldn't see him on the street and be like, yes, you are a white man, but, like, he definitely does have, like, Eurocentric features, and, you know, when I was, like, kind of telling my friends about, like, oh, we got together, or, like, we have this relationship now, or so on and so forth, a lot of people would call us out for being, like, Oxford Studies, which I think is a bit interesting. I just think it's a little demeaning for the relationship, because it's, like, the moment an Asian woman and a white man are seen together in a, like, you know, romantic light, it's like immediately sexualized in a way about, you know, the white man being more dominant towards a more submissive or like more innocent Asian woman, even though it's literally the fact that two people are just getting together and they love each other for who they are. Like, I just think that it's really interesting how this spans past just Asian women in general, but also like women of color and like ethnic women in general, that every single thing we do in a romantic context is always seen as like a sexualized manner, and I just like don't necessarily agree with that. Yeah. Something I also really don't like to see, and this also kind of plays into soft power deficiency, but is oftentimes like guys that we'll see like on Discord or even just like social media platforms, they'll find like Pinterest photos of pretty Asian girls or anime characters and put them as their profile picture, not for the sake of like, oh, they really like this influencer or celebrity or anime character or anime or whatever, but more so for the aesthetic and for like the features of those people. And it's really interesting how it's like you will condemn Asian women, you know, when you see fit, when it doesn't fall within specific categories you need, but then you will use them for the aesthetic or for entertainment when it serves you right. So, as we wrap up today's conversation, it's clear that navigating identity, beauty standards, and cultural representation is no simple feat, especially when these ideals are deeply rooted in history, societal pressures, and media portrayals. But through this episode, I hope you can see how near and dear this topic is towards all of us. All of us have shared experiences and demonstrate how the effects of racism, conflicting with cultural expectations, and Eurocentric ideals have not only impacted our sense of self, but also how we navigate the world around us. These challenges aren't just personal, but they're also a reflection of a broader systemic issue, from our first encounters with microaggressions to the realizations that representation within media still has a long way to go, and is still changing and evolving every single day. Our stories and our shared experiences remind us that progress is happening, but it's definitely far from complete, and there's still a lot of work to be done. However, the point of this episode was to show you that despite these struggles, we're able to come together and reflect on these experiences. And that in itself is inherently so powerful. By sharing our stories in our small way, we help break down these harmful stereotypes. We foster understanding and amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. So, our 2 cents, whether it's redefining beauty standards, embracing both our Western and cultural identities, advocating for genuine representation within media, the takeaway from this episode is that our identities are definitely complex. They're multifaceted, and they're worthy to be heard in all its forms. The journey towards self-acceptance and societal change is one that is ongoing, but it all starts with recognizing the value in our own experiences and voices. So, little cult moment for you guys. 3, 2, 1. So thank you for joining us today on episode 3 of Perfectly Untrue Prayer 6. Okay, that was a little scary. Okay, it's okay. Bye!